Before we delve into this disturbing account, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any stories based on real mysteries and cases that defy logic. Turn on notifications to receive new episodes. Some of them will keep you company for many nights. And now tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Sometimes, the place where you hear this story might be closer to fear than you imagine. In the late 1990s, in the small town of Atchison, Kansas, an ordinary-looking house began to attract attention for reasons that went far beyond its unassuming Victorian facade. The Sallie house stood on a quiet street, surrounded by ancient trees and neighbors who, at first glance, seemed to live a tranquil life. Nothing there indicated that this address would become synonymous with fear, desperate escape, and a direct confrontation between science and something it couldn't explain. The protagonist of this story was neither a curious amateur nor a ghost hunter seeking fame. He was Dr. Michael Harris, an experienced doctor known for his rigorous skepticism. For him, everything had a cause, effect, and rational explanation. Paranormal phenomena were, at most, products of stress, suggestion, or misinterpreted diagnoses. Beside him was his wife Deborah, a nurse, equally trained to rely on data, vital signs, and concrete evidence. Together, they represented absolute trust in logic and science. The antagonist, however, had no clear name, defined face, or stable form. It was something that seemed ingrained in the walls of the house, in the creaking steps of the staircase, and especially in the upstairs bedroom, a small, stuffy room where the air always seemed heavier. Some said that the spirit of a girl named Sallie lived there, who had died after a brutal medical procedure in the 19th century. Others claimed that the entity was not a child, but something much older and more hostile, using the childlike image as a disguise. When Michael and Deborah decided to move into Sallie house, they weren't looking for mystery or adventure. The rent was affordable, the location convenient, and the house seemed structurally sound. To them, ghost stories were just local folklore, exaggerated for generations. Their first mistake was ignoring the immediate unease they felt upon crossing the threshold for the first time, a brief shiver easily rationalized as nervousness or anticipation. In the first few days, small events began to shatter the sense of normalcy. Objects moved without clear explanation. Doors that had been closed would reappear open hours later. Deborah noticed strange smells, similar to old medicines and metal, appearing suddenly and disappearing without reason. Michael, always rational, attributed everything to structural flaws in the house or memory lapses caused by work fatigue. But the house seemed to react in a specific way to their presence, as if testing limits. At night, footsteps echoed in the hallway when they were both lying down. The sound wasn't vague or distant. It was heavy, rhythmic, conscious. Michael even got up several times, examining each room with a flashlight, only to find everything seemingly in order. Still, the feeling of being watched never disappeared. The main conflict began to take shape when the phenomena ceased to be merely environmental and became targeted. Deborah began to feel subtle touches during the early morning hours, like fingers pressing against her skin. One morning, she woke up with reddish marks on her arms, similar to fine scratches. Michael, concerned, examined the injuries as he would in a hospital: superficial, linear, recent. There were no signs of self-harm nor a plausible explanation for their origin. From that moment on, the doctor began to act not as a victim, but as an investigator. He installed cameras and audio recorders and began to note times, patterns, and occurrences. His practical, almost cold demeanor contrasted with the increasing hostility in the house. Sounds intensified. Knocks were heard on the interior walls, as if something were trapped between the rooms. The temperature dropped abruptly in specific areas, especially in the room attributed to the supposed child. The mystery deepened with each attempt at control. The more Michael tried to understand, measure, and record, the more aggressive the presence became. There was no clear dialogue, no obvious messages, only reactions. The house didn't want to be analyzed. It wanted to be feared. The element of doubt grew silently and cruelly. What if it wasn't a child? Who exactly were they challenging? The rationality that had always guided his decisions was beginning to fail him in the face of events that did not obey any known medical or scientific logic. Without realizing it, Michael and Deborah were already caught up in something bigger than a simple haunting case. Sallie House wasn't just a place, it was a battleground. And for the first time in the doctor's career, science seemed insufficient to protect them. The question that lingered in the air was no longer, is this real? But rather, how far was it willing to go? Atchison wasn't just a small town. It was a place where the past never seemed entirely buried. The streets bore 19th century buildings, and many houses had been erected when medicine still navigated between rudimentary beliefs and brutal practices. Makeshift hospitals, surgeries without proper anesthesia, and diagnoses based more on intuition than science were part of the local history, a detail Michael knew only superficially, but one that would begin to take on weight as events intensified. Sallie House, specifically, had been built in 1867. The records were incomplete, but there were vague mentions of a child who supposedly died there after an emergency medical intervention. The procedure, performed inside the house itself, was conducted by a doctor of the time, lacking resources amidst despair and grief. This past echoed silently in the structure of the place. The upstairs room, where everything seemed to converge, was the former room where the child was supposedly treated and died. Deborah felt this more intensely. As a nurse, she had a heightened sensitivity to emotionally charged environments. There was something about that room that couldn't be explained by old stories alone. The silence there was different, dense, almost oppressive. Even during the day, the light seemed to enter unevenly, as if absorbed by the walls before fully illuminating the space. Michael, on the other hand, reacted in the opposite way. His background made him resistant to any emotional interpretation of the facts. He began to study the house's history as if analyzing an old medical record. He spoke with local residents, visited city archives, and gathered fragmented accounts. The versions never coincided completely, but they all converged on one point. No one stayed long in Sallie House without reporting disturbing experiences. Secondary characters began to gain importance in this process. An elderly neighbor who had lived on the street for decades avoided looking directly at the house when talking. He mentioned former tenants who had left in a hurry, leaving furniture behind. A local library employee revealed that some documents about the residents had mysteriously disappeared from the physical archives years before. None of this was concrete proof, but it formed a disturbing pattern. The entity, if it could be called that, seemed to react selectively. Deborah was the most frequent target. Soft sounds, similar to muffled cries, would appear when she was alone. Old toys, which did not belong to the couple, would appear in the upstairs bedroom and then disappear. In contrast, Michael faced more aggressive manifestations. Loud banging, thrown objects, and a constant sense of defiance, as if his presence were a direct provocation. This contrast began to reveal something disturbing about the nature of the force in the house. It didn't manifest itself by chance. There was intention, choice, and adaptation. The presence seemed to understand who they were, what they represented, and above all, what Michael symbolized. Modern, rational medicine, distant from the pain and fear that marked the house's past. Culturally, Atchison had always lived with ghost stories, but Sallie House occupied a unique place in the local imagination. It wasn't seen as a tourist attraction, but as a mistake, something that should be ignored. This collective attitude of silence seemed to function as an extra layer of isolation, making the couple even more vulnerable. As the days passed, The characters subtly transformed. Deborah became more cautious, avoiding certain rooms, altering routines, reacting more on instinct than logic. Michael, in turn, obsessively immersed himself in trying to understand and control the situation. His skepticism began to mix with frustration, something dangerous for someone accustomed to having absolute control over crisis situations. The antagonist remained invisible, but increasingly present. There was no clear revelation of its origin or form, only contradictory clues. The more the couple tried to fit the entity into the narrative of little Sallie, the more events suggested something wrong with that interpretation. The house seemed too old, too conscious, too violent to be just the spirit of a child. The world of the story was closing in around them. Sallie House wasn't just a setting, but an active force shaping behaviors, decisions, and emotions. And without realizing it, Michael and Deborah were ceasing to be mere residents. They were becoming pieces of something that seemed to repeat itself over time. The doubt was now deeper and more unsettling. They were dealing with a ghost, or with something that was merely using this story as a mask. The conflict ceased to be subtle when the house began to directly interfere with the couple's routine. It was no longer possible to pretend everything was normal. Events began to follow a clear progression, as if something were testing limits, assessing reactions, and adjusting its intensity according to the resistance encountered. The first real rupture occurred one night, too quiet for an old house. Michael woke with a sudden pressure in his chest, similar to the clinical sensation of shortness of breath. His medical instincts kicked in immediately. He sat up, took a deep breath, and assessed his body. Everything seemed normal, except for the invisible weight that insisted on keeping him lying down. When he finally managed to get up, he found recent marks on his skin, fine, reddish lines, arranged almost symmetrically. Deborah tried to treat the wounds as she would any patient, but her hands trembled. It didn't fit any logical pattern. They weren't ordinary cuts, nor scratches caused by human fingernails. There was something deliberate about the way the marks appeared. From that point on, Sallie House began to assert itself as a dominant presence. The cameras installed by Michael began to selectively malfunction. Some would shut down on their own, others would record only static when more intense phenomena occurred. The recorders picked up sounds that did not correspond to any human activity, distorted whispers, internal thumps, organic noises, too much to be explained as electrical interference. Michael, pressured by the escalating events, decided to confront the situation with more direct methods. He brought medical colleagues to spend a night at the house, believing that trained witnesses could offer a more objective interpretation of the phenomena. The decision, however, produced the opposite effect. That night, the atmosphere immediately became hostile. The temperature dropped abruptly, concentrating on the upper floor. Lights went out simultaneously. One of the doctors reported feeling intensely nauseous. Another had a panic attack for no apparent reason. When footsteps began to echo above them, fast, heavy, furious, the attempt at scientific observation turned into a flight. None of the visitors remained until dawn. This episode marked a crucial turning point. The house did not tolerate outside observers. Any attempt to expose them was met with escalating violence. Deborah began to suffer more direct attacks. Objects were thrown at her when she was alone. Doors would slam shut behind her, isolating her in specific rooms. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the basement, she felt a force push her against the wall. The impact left a deep bruise on her back. There was no possible mechanical explanation. The supporting characters also began to feel the effects of the conflict. Neighbors reported sounds coming from the house at night, muffled screams and banging that didn't match the couple's presence. One of them even called the police, but no abnormality was officially recorded. Sallie House seemed to know exactly when to hide. The emotional conflict between Michael and Deborah intensified along with the supernatural. She advocated leaving the house. He insisted on staying, convinced that they were facing an extreme yet still understandable phenomenon. His stance was no longer merely rational, it had become obstinate. For Michael, leaving meant admitting that there was something beyond his control, something he could not diagnose, treat, or contain. The organization responded to this resistance in a brutal manner. During a particularly tense night, Michael felt something grab his legs while he slept. He was pulled out of bed with enough force to leave him breathless. Deborah woke with the impact and saw her husband being dragged down the hallway as if invisible hands were guiding him. When the force subsided, Michael was covered in deep cuts, some bleeding profusely. For the first time, science had completely failed. There was no neurological, psychological, or environmental explanation capable of justifying it. The conflict had reached a new level. The house was now trying to seriously injure, perhaps even kill. Michael began recording not only data, but emotional reactions: fear, anger, humiliation. The entity seemed to feed on these responses, intensifying its attacks as the tension increased. Each attempt at control generated a proportionally more violent reaction. The room assigned to the child became the epicenter of the conflict. Sounds of children's footsteps mingled with aggressive banging on the walls. On some nights, the door locked itself. On others, it opened slowly, like a silent invitation. Deborah refused to enter. Michael, on the other hand, felt drawn to the space, as if something were directly challenging him. The unfolding conflict made it clear that this was no longer a simple haunting. There was strategy, adaptation, and a conscious escalation. Sallie House didn't just want to scare, it wanted to break down resistance, test limits, and impose dominance. And deep down, a disturbing truth was beginning to take shape. The more Michael tried to prove that it wasn't real, the more real and violent it became. The question that now arose was not whether they would survive that experience, but how long would the house allow them to resist. With the main conflict escalating, new layers began to intertwine with the couple's experience, deepening the horror in a less visible, yet equally destructive way. Sallie House no longer attacked only bodies or objects. It began to corrode relationships, certainties, and the very notion of time within the house. One of the most disturbing subplots emerged through the fragmented historical records that Michael managed to gather. By comparing dates, names, and scattered accounts, he noticed a disturbing pattern. Different families, at different times, had gone through similar experiences: invisible aggressions, physical marks, a feeling of being persecuted, but always with a recurring detail. At some point, there was someone involved in the healthcare field: doctors, nurses, midwives, never just ordinary civilians. This discovery brought no relief. On the contrary, it suggested that the entity did not act randomly. It seemed to react specifically to those who symbolized medicine, as if it carried a distorted memory of pain, error, and resentment accumulated over decades. While Michael was immersed in this obsessive investigation, Deborah faced her own silent battle. She began to experience lapses in time within the house, moments when she believed she had spent only a few minutes in a room, only to realize that hours had passed. On one of these occasions, she was found sitting on the floor of the upstairs bedroom, holding a small, rusty object, an old surgical blade that neither of them remembered seeing before. Deborah couldn't remember how she had gotten there. Time pressure became a constant presence. Nights seemed to stretch indefinitely, while days passed too quickly. Clocks would stop, start again with incorrect times, or simply fall off the walls for no apparent reason. This distortion affected the couple's emotional balance, making simple decisions difficult and intensifying each argument. A crucial subplot emerged when Deborah began to question the true nature of the entity. To her, it didn't behave like the spirit of a child. The attacks were too calculated, too cruel. The supposed innocence associated with Sallie clashed with the escalating violence. Deborah began to avoid mentioning the girl's name, realizing that it seemed to provoke immediate reactions from the house. Bangs, objects falling, sudden changes in temperature. Michael, however, still clung to the known narrative. Admitting they were dealing with something different would mean abandoning any framework of understanding. This divergence created an emotional fracture between the two. Arguments arose not because of fear, but because interpretation of fear to stay or to flee, to confront or to surrender. Each choice seemed to hasten the house's response. Meanwhile, the couple's relationship with the outside world began to deteriorate. Friends distanced themselves after witnessing small, inexplicable incidents. Michael's colleagues avoided the subject, treating his accounts as signs of psychological exhaustion. Deborah felt increasingly isolated, trapped in an environment that seemed to reject any attempt at external intervention. Sallie House exploited these vulnerabilities with cruel precision. On some nights, it adopted an almost conciliatory stance. Soft sounds like children's laughter echoed through the hallway. The house seemed calm, almost welcoming. This false truce created hope, only to be shattered by more violent attacks soon after. The alternation between silence and aggression kept the couple in a constant state of alert. Another important subplot involved the blame Michael began to mentally relive past professional mistakes. Late diagnoses, risky procedures, lost patients. The house seemed to bring these memories to the surface, projecting shadows, distorted voices, and fleeting images that mimicked old hospital environments. They weren't complete memories, but enough fragments to shake his self-confidence. All these complexities converged on one clear point. The entity not only inhabited the house, she deeply understood its inhabitants. She knew where to apply pressure, when to retreat, and how to manipulate emotions to prolong suffering. The subplots, previously running parallel, now intertwined with the central conflict, making it clear that time was running out. Sallie House didn't seem interested in evicting them quickly. They wanted something slower, something deeper. And the growing feeling was terrifying. The house wasn't just reacting, it was preparing something. The turning point didn't come explosively. It settled in quietly, like a decision that had been made long before Michael and Deborah realized it. The house seemed strangely calm that night, too quiet for a place that had turned chaos into routine. There were no knocks, no footsteps, no whispers. The absence of phenomena was the first sign of danger. Michael, accustomed to constant tension, felt the silence as a provocation. The lack of stimuli broke his pattern of vigilance. For the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. Deborah, on the other hand, remained awake, sitting on the bed, watching the hallway lit by a dim lamp. The air was thick, almost still. That's when she heard a voice. It wasn't an indistinct whisper or a distant sound. It was clear, childlike, and too close. "Can you help me?" Deborah felt her body go cold. The voice didn't come from a specific place. It seemed to emerge from within the house, mingling with the walls, the floor, the very air. Instinctively, she woke Michael. He heard it too. For the first time, there was no doubt, no attempt at rationalization. The entity was speaking. The voice repeated itself, now with a pained inflection. It spoke of a stomach ache, of cold hands, of someone who had made a mistake. The words were fragmented but laden with suffering. The narrative coincided with historical accounts of the death of the girl, Sallie. That was exactly what Michael needed to validate his hypothesis. Convinced that he finally understood the phenomenon, he decided to act. He got dressed, grabbed a flashlight, and went upstairs to the upper bedroom. Deborah tried to stop him. There was something wrong with that sudden clarity, that attempt at empathy that came too late. But Michael was determined. For the first time, the house seemed to allow for closeness. The room was different, brighter, less oppressive. An old toy rested in the center of the floor, perfectly positioned. When Michael entered, the door closed behind him with a soft click, not aggressive, but definitive. Inside the room, the temperature dropped rapidly. The voice returned, now closer, more insistent. Michael answered, not with fear, but with the professional authority he had carried throughout his life. He spoke as a doctor. He asked for calm. He promised help. He promised to correct the mistake. It was at that moment that everything was revealed. The child's voice became distorted. It grew deep, grave, laden with multiple layers of sound. The walls vibrated. The toy broke in half without being touched. The air grew heavy, suffocating. What answered Michael was not a child. You always promise, and you always fail. The revelation was devastating. The images that emerged didn't belong solely to Sallie House. Michael saw fragments of other eras, other places, other houses. He saw old doctors, brutal procedures, accumulated pain, crystallized fear. The entity wasn't born there. She fed on medical suffering, of mistakes, of unexplained deaths, of promises made too late. The child figure was merely a mask, a decoy. Meanwhile, Deborah desperately tried to open the door. The house reacted, blocking corridors, distorting distances. Time seemed to slow down, as if the structure itself wanted to prolong that specific moment. Inside the room, Michael fell to his knees. For the first time, there were no data, no diagnoses, no control. Only the brutal realization that his presence there was not accidental. He had not been chosen by chance. He represented everything the entity hated and everything it needed to strengthen itself. The attack wasn't immediate, it was psychological. The entity exposed every failure, every death, every medical decision made under pressure, not as ordinary memories, but as living accusations projected into the surrounding space. Michael felt stripped of his professional identity. The doctor became the patient, the observer became the object. When Deborah finally reached the bedroom, she found her husband unconscious on the floor, covered in recent bruises. The door opened by itself, as if the house only allowed rescue after the damage was done. Michael survived, but something had been broken irreversibly. Upon waking, he didn't try to explain what he saw. He didn't argue. He didn't rationalize. He simply uttered a short sentence that completely changed the course of history. We were never alone here, and she was never a child. The turning point was complete. The house had revealed its true nature. The fight was no longer against a localized haunting, but against something ancient, conscious and hungry, something it now knew exactly, who they were and how much could they endure. And from that moment on, it was no longer a matter of proving anything. It was about to survive what has been awakened. After the night in the upper room, Sallie House never returned to its previous state. The deceptive calm had vanished, replaced by a constant, dense, almost palpable presence. It was no longer necessary for anything to move or make a sound for the terror to be felt. Its mere presence was enough. Michael had visibly changed. The man who had previously faced events with an analytical demeanor now moved with extreme caution, avoiding certain spaces and keeping his distance from the upper floor. His body bore the marks of the attack, but it was his gaze that betrayed the deepest impact. There was a silent vigilance in him, as if he were always anticipating something that only he could perceive. Deborah reacted differently. The experience pushed her into action. For the first time since they moved, she took control of practical decisions. She began planning their departure from the house, packing essential belongings, organizing documents, but each attempt was sabotaged. Boxes disappeared, doors locked, noises arose whenever she mentioned leaving. The house reacted to the idea of abandonment as if it were a direct threat. The entity, now revealed, intensified its emotional influence. It no longer needed constant physical attacks. It began to act strategically, exploiting the recent trauma. Sounds similar to heart monitors echoed at night. The metallic smell of blood appeared without warning. At certain moments, Michael would enter a state of sudden paralysis, unable to move, while images of old operating rooms were projected on the walls. The social consequences also became inevitable. Michael permanently distanced himself from the hospital. Colleagues noticed drastic changes in his behavior. He avoided human contact, refused invitations, and could no longer remain in clinical settings without showing clear signs of panic. His professional identity, built over decades, began to crumble. Deborah, in turn, began to sleep very little. Her body reacted with insomnia, tremors, and a constant feeling of alertness. Even so, she maintained a clarity that Michael had lost. She was the one who now observed patterns, anticipated reactions from the house, and made quick decisions when the manifestations intensified. Sallie House seemed to feed off this imbalance. The more Michael withdrew, the closer the entity got. Not with explicit violence, but with induced memories, intrusive dreams, and sensory distortions. His professional past was used as a weapon, reinforcing guilt and helplessness. There were outside attempts at help. A paranormal investigator was invited to spend a night in the house. He didn't stay more than a few hours. He left pale, confused, unable to explain what he had seen. A local religious leader attempted an informal blessing. The result was immediate. Broken objects, screams that didn't come from any human throat, and an even more oppressive silence afterward. These reactions made it clear that the entity not only resisted interference, she punished attempts at intervention. The house seemed isolated from the outside world, functioning as a closed system where only its occupants were subject to the imposed rules. The psychological impact reached a critical point when Michael began to question his own sanity. He knew what he had seen, but he also knew the limits of the human mind. This constant doubt made him vulnerable, and the entity exploited this with cruel precision. Each night was a repetition of alertness, fear, and exhaustion. Deborah realized something essential. The house didn't just want immediate suffering. It wanted permanence. I wanted them to stay, to slowly wear down, to become part of the silent history that had been accumulating there for decades. The consequences of the tipping point were clear and irreversible. Nothing could go back to normal. The couple was no longer trying to understand what was happening. They were trying to resist the emotional and physical collapse imposed by a force that now felt safe, strengthened, and fully aware. The question that dominated every decision was no longer, "What is that?" but rather, "What will happen if we stay? And what will she do if we try to leave?" Michael's transformation didn't happen suddenly. There was no heroic moment or grand decision. The growth came from exhaustion, from repeating fear, and from the slow realization that resisting in the same way meant failing again. Sallie House had won every direct confrontation. Persisting in that pattern was only offering more food to the entity. The first sign of change was silent. Michael stopped recording phenomena. The cameras were turned off, the recorders put away. For the first time since they arrived at the house, he stopped observing and began to feel the environment. Not as a doctor, but as someone willing to acknowledge limits. Deborah noticed the change immediately. Her husband began to avoid impulsive reactions. When noises arose, he no longer ran towards them. When objects moved, he didn't try to explain. This refusal to respond seemed to confuse the household. The entity still manifested itself, but with less intensity, as if it were testing new stimuli. The real growth, however, occurred when Michael confronted something he had always avoided. To blame, instead of running away from the professional memories that surfaced, he began to confront them consciously, not as accusations, but as inevitable facts of a profession built on impossible decisions. This acceptance did not eliminate the pain, but it reduced the power that the entity exerted over him. Deborah also underwent her own evolution. Previously reactive, she now became strategic. She observed schedules, patterns of silence, subtle changes in the atmosphere of the house. She realized that certain behaviors decreased the entity's activity, especially moments of genuine calm without explicit fear. The house seemed less active when it didn't receive intense emotional responses. The couple began to act in a coordinated manner. They no longer argued about staying or leaving. The decision was consciously postponed. First, they needed to regain emotional control. They created simple, repetitive, almost monastic routines, eating at fixed times, sleeping in the same room, avoiding the upper floor completely. The entity reacted with attempts at provocation. Sounds emerged near the stairs. The child's voice returned occasionally, but now it sounded incomplete, faltering, as if it had lost its effectiveness. The couple's growth was undermining the house's main weapon, its ability to react. Michael came to understand something essential. The entity was not strengthened solely by fear, but by internal conflict. The more he struggled with who he was, a doctor, rational, fallible, the more vulnerable he became. By accepting his identity without trying to defend it, something changed in the dynamic. This overcoming was not a victory, but a precarious balance. Sallie House was still dangerous. There were still difficult nights, unexpected manifestations, and moments of pure terror. But now the couple was no longer in constant collapse. A tenuous line of stability was being built. The growth culminated in a practical and symbolic decision. Michael wrote a letter, not an apology nor a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. He recognized human error, the limitations of medicine past and present, and the impossibility of correcting certain pains. The letter was not read aloud. It was left in the upstairs room. On the threshold of the door, they refused to cross again. That night, the house remained in absolute silence. No sound, no change in temperature, no perceptible presence. It wasn't peace, it was observation. The couple's growth had changed the game. They were no longer reacting, they were choosing how to exist within the space. This didn't entirely weaken the entity, but it limited its influence. Sallie House seemed to assess this new posture, like a predator facing prey that no longer flees. Overcoming the challenge didn't bring complete relief, but it brought something essential: emotional autonomy. For the first time, Michael and Deborah didn't feel defined by the house. It was still there, but it didn't control every thought, every reaction, every choice. This growth paved the way for the inevitable. Because despite the temporary stability, they both knew that it couldn't last forever. The house did not allow for indefinite coexistence, and the question that formed, silent and heavy, was simple and terrifying. What would Sallie House do when she realized she had lost control? The change in the house's behavior didn't signify surrender. The prolonged silence took on a different weight. It wasn't an absence of threat, but restraint. Michael and Deborah felt it in every detail. The air seemed colder, more static, as if the house were holding something back, waiting for the right moment. The first indication that the balance was breaking down came subtly. Small objects began to reappear in the hallways. The broken toy, the rusty surgical blade, old stained papers. Nothing was thrown or moved violently. Everything appeared carefully positioned, like souvenirs left on purpose. Deborah realized that these objects formed a path, not an explicit one, but a progressive one. It began in the living room, continued down the hallway, and ended in front of the staircase leading to the upper floor. The house didn't forcefully push them along. He invited. Time pressure returned. Clocks started working correctly, but they all showed slightly different times. The day seemed to shorten. Night arrived too quickly. A sense of urgency seeped into the routine, even without violent events. Michael understood that the entity was reorganizing itself. It no longer needed to test emotional limits. Now it wanted closure. The couple's continued emotional control represented a stalemate, and Sallie House did not tolerate stalemates. Final attempts to escape were made in silence. Deborah packed only the essentials, avoiding any verbal mention. Still, the car wouldn't start. The doors locked themselves. There was no attack, just a blockage. The message was clear. The final choice would have to happen there. Psychological preparation became a priority. The couple spoke little, but clearly. They didn't discuss heroic strategies or direct confrontations. They understood that the climax wouldn't be won by force, nor by escape. It would be won by the decision to face the truth that the entity was trying to distort. Michael mentally revisited everything he had learned. The entity fed on guilt, fear, and conflict. The childlike mask was a tool. The goal had never been to kill quickly, but to corrode identities until only submission remained. They decided on something simple yet radical. They would go to the upper room, together, not as a provocation, not as a challenge, as a conclusion. The chosen night held no special significance, no symbolic date, no external event. This in itself seemed to unsettle the house. Sounds briefly surfaced, doors creaked, but nothing intensified. It was as if the entity was testing their conviction one last time. As they climbed the stairs, the pressure in the room increased. The air became thick, making breathing difficult. Distorted images appeared in the corners of their vision. They weren't attacks, but distractions, attempts to break the emotional concentration they had built up. The upstairs room was locked. The door looked different, older, more worn. The objects scattered on the floor were now arranged in a circle. In the center, the letter left by Michael remained untouched. Before touching the doorknob, Deborah felt the entity's presence more clearly than ever before. Not as something behind the door, but throughout the house. Every wall, every step, every space carried the same intention. The build-up to the climax wasn't about physical courage. It was about don't give in emotionally. It was about acknowledging suffering without allowing it to define who they were. The entity wanted a specific reaction: fear, despair, submission. They wouldn't offer any of them. When Michael finally grasped the doorknob, the silence became absolute. No sound came from anywhere. Not even the usual creaking of the house. It was the last warning. Sallie House was ready to reveal everything, or to destroy what still resisted. And the climax wouldn't be an immediate explosion. It would be a slow, intimate, and irreversible confrontation. When the upstairs bedroom door opened, there was no creak. The silence was absolute, as if the house had held its own breath. Michael and Deborah entered together. The door closed behind them gently, without violence. It simply closed, like an agreement fulfilled. The room was no longer just a room. The walls seemed to extend beyond their physical limits, creating a sense of distorted space. The light was uneven, without a defined source. The air was heavy, permeated with a metallic smell, all too familiar to both of them. In the center of the room, the objects formed a perfect circle. The broken toy, the surgical blade, papers stained with something that didn't seem to be just ink. The letter remained there, untouched. The entity's presence manifested itself without a defined form. There was no clear apparition. Instead, the environment reacted. The walls pulsed slowly. The floor vibrated beneath one's feet. Overlapping sounds emerged: infant cries, adult moans, ancient medical orders, all mixed into a single sonic mass. The voice spoke again. Not childish, not adult. All at the same time. "Are you here to ask for forgiveness?" Michael felt the immediate urge to respond as he always had, to explain, justify, rationalize. But he restrained himself. The growth they had built together culminated in that moment. He wasn't there to prove anything. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We've come to wrap things up." The entity reacted. The The circle slowly closed, objects sliding across the floor as if pulled by something invisible. The surrounding images intensified. Scenes of ancient procedures, bodies forcibly restrained, mistakes made under pressure appeared on the walls like living projections. The entity tried to break them individually. Deborah saw patients she had lost, faces she recognized, accusatory stares. Michael saw versions of himself from different eras, always failing, always late, always wrong. The emotional pressure was overwhelming. Then came the turning point. The organization revealed its limitations. She needed response. It needed an intense emotional reaction to sustain itself. The confrontation wasn't physical nor spiritual in the traditional sense. It was psychological and symbolic. As long as there was active guilt, paralyzing fear, or a belated attempt at redemption, it would have power. Michael stepped forward and did something he had never done before. He didn't defend himself. "We made a mistake," he said. "Everyone makes mistakes. Medicine makes mistakes. Humanity makes mistakes. And some pains are beyond repair." The entity reacted violently. The walls trembled, the sound intensified, the air became suffocating. It was a last-ditch effort. Deborah held his hand and added, "But that doesn't give you the right to keep us here." There was a breaking point. The sound ceased abruptly. Images dissolved like smoke. The circle on the floor became disorganized, objects falling aimlessly. The presence that filled the room retreated, not in total defeat, but because loss of access. The entity tried one last thing. The child's voice returned, weak, pleading for help. Neither of them responded. Not out of cruelty, but out of understanding. The room began to contract. The walls returned to their normal size. The light stabilized. The metallic smell disappeared. The climax didn't end with a dramatic expulsion or visible destruction. It ended with something more disturbing. The entity was deprived of what sustained it. When the door opened by itself, the hallway seemed ordinary, silent, empty. Michael and Deborah left the room without looking back. There was no chase. There was no final attack. Sallie House had not been cleansed. But it had been broken at its core dynamic. Terror was not defeated by force, faith, or science. He was confronted by recognition and limitations. And that changed everything. The following morning arrived without fanfare. There was no abrupt change in the appearance of Sallie House. The walls remained the same worn shade, the floor creaked underfoot, and the sunlight streamed through the windows in the same uneven pattern as always. Yet, something fundamental had changed. The house was silent. Not a heavy or threatening silence, but a strange, almost uncomfortable emptiness. Michael and Deborah moved cautiously through the rooms, alert for any sign of the presence returning. Nothing happened. No change in temperature. No out-of-place sounds. No feeling of constant surveillance. They quickly understood that this did not mean absolute security. The entity had not been destroyed. Only private domain. Sallie House had ceased to be an active space for confrontation and had become a wounded, incomplete place, incapable of sustaining the cycle of terror it had maintained for decades. The departure was simple, without resistance. The car started on the first try. The doors opened normally. The house didn't react to the abandonment. It didn't try to stop it, didn't provoke it, didn't punish it. This lack of response was, in a way, the final confirmation that the balance had shifted. Michael never practiced medicine the same way again. He returned to the hospital months later, but in a different role, far from risky procedures. He became more aware of limits, not just those of science, but of himself. Rigid skepticism gave way to quiet caution. He didn't talk about Sallie House, but the experience shaped every future decision. Deborah also changed. More aware of human frailty, she became less tolerant of environments that demanded constant emotional repression. Her instinct, previously ignored, became a survival tool. She was the one who preserved the memory of what they had lived through, not as a dominant trauma, but as an irreversible lesson. Over time, new residents passed through Sallie House. Some stayed a short time, others a little longer. Strange reports continued to surface, but without the intensity described in previous years. The house seemed incapable of repeating the same pattern. The terror had lost its momentum. The conclusion did not bring absolute closure. There was no justice for the past, nor a definitive explanation for the entity. Some pains remain nameless, and some stories do not ask for understanding, only respect from a distance. Michael and Deborah went on with their lives knowing that certain places aren't bad by chance. They're built from layers of unresolved suffering, fueled by silence and denial. They didn't win at Sallie House, but she didn't consume them either, and sometimes simply surviving without being broken is the most profound form of victory. Years later, a visitor stood for a few minutes before Sallie House at dusk. He didn't go in. He merely observed. The house seemed ordinary, almost forgotten by time. Yet, as he walked away, he felt a sudden shiver, not of threat, but of recognition. Inside the upper room, an old object lay motionless in the corner, covered in dust. The letter left by Michael was never found. On some nights, residents of the street report an absolute silence, too profound to be natural, as if something were still there, not expecting victims, but remember that it has already been fed. If this story left you with that unsettling feeling that not all horror needs visible monsters, share your thoughts. Do you believe Sallie House was truly silenced, or did it simply learn to wait? Leave a comment telling us what gave you the most chills, the entity, the house, or the idea that fear feeds on our own guilt. If you enjoy stories based on true mysteries, psychological horror, and places that bear the marks of the past, subscribe to the channel and follow the upcoming narratives. And now we want to know, where are you watching from, and what story would you like